Emma had dreamed about her wedding since she was a little girl, but nothing in those dreams prepared her for the moment. She looked across a room, filled with smiling friends and family, and locked eyes with the one man she had spent years trying to forget. Standing only a few feet away from the altar, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and an expression she recognized all too well, was Ryan, the man who had once promised to love her forever before leaving her emotionally broken. For a brief second, Emma wondered if she was imagining things. Then she saw her mother, Linda, walking toward Ryan with a warm smile before placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, as though he belonged there. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the music echoing through the chapel. Daniel, the man waiting at the altar to become her husband, had no idea that the happiest day of their lives had just taken a turn neither of them could have imagined. Emma wasn't afraid of seeing Ryan again. What terrified her was realizing that someone she trusted more than anyone else had secretly opened the door for him to return at the exact moment she believed she had finally left the past behind. By the time the ceremony ended, hidden conversations, family secrets, and years of carefully buried emotions would begin coming to light, leaving everyone who witnessed that wedding questioning how well they truly knew the people closest to them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Every family has disagreements, but few betrayals cut as deeply as the ones that arrive wearing the face of someone who raised you. Looking back, Emma often wondered whether the warning signs had been there all along or whether love had simply convinced her to overlook them. Friends later admitted they had noticed strange moments during the months leading up to the wedding, moments that seemed insignificant until everything finally made sense. A delayed phone call here, an uncomfortable silence there, a conversation that stopped the instant Emma entered the room. At the time, she dismissed each one as ordinary wedding stress. Planning a wedding meant endless decisions, emotional relatives, and unexpected disagreements, so she never imagined those scattered moments were connected. She believed her biggest challenge would be deciding between floral arrangements or seating charts, not discovering that someone inside her own family had been making decisions capable of changing the entire course of her future. As the truth slowly unfolded, Emma realized the wedding itself had become the stage for a much older story, one that had begun years before Daniel ever entered her life, and one her mother had quietly refused to let end. The closer Emma came to saying, "I do," the closer long-buried memories came to demanding answers she had spent years trying to avoid. Long before Daniel proposed beneath a canopy of autumn leaves in a quiet park outside Boston, Emma believed she had already found the man she would spend the rest of her life with. Ryan had entered her world during her final year of college, charming everyone around him with an easy smile, quick humor, and an uncanny ability to make people feel as though they were the most important person in the room. Emma's friends admired him, her coworkers enjoyed his company, and, perhaps most importantly, her mother, Linda, adored him almost from the moment they met. Linda often described Ryan as respectful, ambitious, and dependable, qualities she believed every husband should possess. Whenever Ryan visited for Sunday dinner, he offered to help clear the table, fixed little things around the house without being asked, and remembered Linda's birthday every year. To anyone looking from the outside, he appeared to be exactly the kind of man every parent hoped their daughter would marry. Emma saw those same qualities at first, but over time, she began noticing another side of Ryan that almost no one else ever witnessed. He disliked when she spent evenings with friends without telling him every detail. He questioned innocent conversations with male coworkers and expected constant reassurance that he remained the center of her attention. If Emma disagreed with him, he rarely raised his voice, yet somehow every disagreement ended with her apologizing for problems she hadn't created. Little by little, her confidence faded until she found herself second-guessing even the smallest decisions. She couldn't explain it clearly to anyone because there were no dramatic scenes for people to point to, only countless moments that left her feeling smaller than she had the day before. Emma kept much of her growing unhappiness to herself because she feared people would misunderstand. Whenever she hinted that something felt wrong, Linda gently dismissed her concerns, insisting every serious relationship required compromise. She reminded Emma that no one was perfect and warned her against throwing away a good man over what she called ordinary growing pains. Those conversations left Emma feeling more isolated than before. She started questioning whether she was expecting too much or imagining problems that didn't really exist. Months turned into years, and although Ryan continued presenting his best self to the outside world, Emma quietly carried the emotional weight of a relationship that no longer felt safe or joyful. The breaking point came one rainy evening after a disagreement about her accepting a promotion that required occasional travel. Ryan argued that the job would take her away from their future together and accused her of placing her career above their relationship. Emma listened in silence until she realized something that changed everything. The conversation was no longer about work. It was about control. Standing in the middle of their apartment, surrounded by photographs that captured happier times, she understood she could spend the rest of her life defending every dream she pursued, or she could walk away before losing herself completely. The decision shattered her heart because she still cared about the man Ryan had once seemed to be. But she finally accepted that loving someone was never enough if the relationship slowly erased the person she had worked so hard to become. When she ended the relationship, Ryan left without yelling or making a dramatic scene. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes and quietly said, "You'll realize one day that you're making the biggest mistake of your life." Emma believed those words would eventually fade into memory. She had no way of knowing they would return to haunt her on the morning she was supposed to begin the happiest chapter of her future. The months that followed the breakup were some of the hardest Emma had ever experienced, but they also became the months that slowly gave her life back. At first, everything reminded her of Ryan. The coffee shop where they met after work, the hiking trails they explored on weekends, even songs on the radio seemed determined to reopen wounds she was trying desperately to heal. She threw herself into her career, accepted the promotion she had once been afraid to take, and began traveling across the country for conferences and client meetings. Every new city reminded her that the world was much bigger than the apartment where she had spent years questioning herself. Her coworkers noticed the change almost immediately. The quiet woman who once hesitated before sharing an idea in meetings gradually became confident enough to lead presentations, mentor younger employees, and volunteer for projects that challenged her. Friends who had watched her relationship with Ryan from a distance admitted they had been worried about her for a long time, but never knew how to express their concerns without pushing her away. Emma appreciated their honesty, though one relationship remained painfully complicated. Linda refused to accept that the breakup had truly ended. Almost every conversation somehow returned to Ryan. She would casually mention seeing him at the grocery store, hearing about his latest promotion from a mutual acquaintance, or learning that he was still asking about Emma. At first, Emma believed those comments were harmless. She assumed her mother simply needed more time to let go of someone she had once considered family. She never imagined Linda was doing far more than remembering the past. About a year later, Emma attended a charity fundraiser organized by her company, expecting nothing more than another evening of networking and polite conversation. That was where she met Daniel. Unlike Ryan, Daniel never tried to impress everyone in the room. He spent most of the evening helping volunteers move tables, laughing with elderly guests, and making sure everyone else was comfortable before thinking about himself. Their first conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Yet Emma left feeling lighter than she had in years. Daniel asked questions because he genuinely wanted to know the answers. He listened without interrupting. When Emma spoke about her work, he celebrated her accomplishments instead of questioning whether they left enough room for a relationship. Over the following months, their friendship grew naturally. There were no games, no emotional tests, and no endless arguments that left one person apologizing simply to restore peace. Daniel made Emma feel seen in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Even Linda admitted during their first meeting that Daniel seemed kind and respectful, although there was a hesitation in her voice that Emma couldn't quite understand. She smiled politely, complimented his manners, and welcomed him into the family. Yet something about her enthusiasm felt restrained, almost rehearsed. Daniel noticed it too, but chose not to mention it, believing some parents simply needed time to adjust when their children entered serious relationships. Neither of them realized Linda was quietly comparing every conversation, every gesture, and every shared moment to someone she still hadn't fully released from her heart. While Emma and Daniel were building a future together, Linda was holding on to a version of the past that existed only in her own mind, and before long that quiet attachment would become impossible for anyone in the family to ignore. When Daniel proposed the following spring, Emma didn't hesitate for even a second. It happened during a weekend getaway to a quiet lakeside cabin where they had gone to celebrate her birthday. As the sun disappeared behind the water, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, smiled with the same calm confidence Emma had come to admire, and asked if she would spend the rest of her life with him. There were no hidden cameras, no elaborate audience, and no grand performance designed for social media. It was simple, sincere, and exactly the kind of moment Emma had always wanted. She said yes through tears of happiness, and before they had even driven back home, they were calling family and close friends to share the news. Most people reacted with excitement, but Linda's response caught Emma slightly off guard. She congratulated them warmly over the phone, yet there was a long pause before she asked, "Are you sure you're not rushing into this?" Emma laughed softly, assuming every mother worried about her daughter's future. She reassured Linda that she had never been more certain about any decision in her life. Linda replied that she only wanted what was best for her daughter, and the conversation ended pleasantly enough. Still, after hanging up, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unsaid. Daniel noticed the thoughtful expression on her face during dinner that evening, but Emma brushed it aside, insisting it was nothing more than ordinary pre-wedding nerves beginning earlier than expected. The wedding planning started almost immediately, filling weekends with venue tours, cake tastings, florist appointments, and endless conversations about guest lists. Emma wanted an intimate ceremony with only close family and longtime friends, while Daniel hoped to include a few colleagues who had become like brothers over the years. They compromised easily because every decision felt like another step toward the life they were building together. Linda offered to help with nearly everything. She volunteered to contact relatives, coordinate hotel reservations for out-of-town guests, and even insisted on organizing the final guest list to save Emma unnecessary stress. Grateful for the support, Emma happily accepted. Looking back, she would later describe that decision as the moment she unknowingly surrendered control of the most important day of her life. Linda handled every request efficiently, keeping detailed notes inside a leather planner she carried everywhere. Whenever Emma asked how preparations were going, her mother always smiled and answered that everything was under control. There was never a reason to question her. After all, Linda had planned charity events, church fundraisers, and countless family celebrations over the years. Organization was one of her greatest strengths. Emma believed she was simply fortunate to have a mother willing to shoulder so much responsibility. What she didn't know was that Linda had quietly begun making changes to the guest list that no one else had approved, and those changes weren't simple mistakes or forgotten names. They were deliberate choices rooted in beliefs she had never shared with either Emma or Daniel. Several weeks later, an unexpected conversation planted the first real seed of doubt. Emma had stopped by Linda's house one Saturday afternoon to drop off fabric samples for the reception tables. As she walked toward the kitchen, she heard her mother speaking on the phone in a voice so gentle it immediately caught her attention. Linda quickly ended the call the moment she noticed Emma standing in the doorway. When Emma jokingly asked who had been lucky enough to receive such special treatment, Linda smiled a little too quickly and replied that it was an old church friend asking about the wedding. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something about it lingered in Emma's mind long after she left. 2 days later, while finalizing invitations with Daniel, she noticed an unfamiliar name penciled into Linda's handwritten guest list. Before she could ask about it, Linda calmly crossed it out, saying she had accidentally included someone who couldn't attend after all. Emma accepted the explanation without another thought. It seemed too small to matter. Yet sometimes the moments that change our lives arrive disguised as ordinary details, so ordinary that we dismiss them without realizing they are quietly leading us toward a truth we never expected to uncover. At that very moment, while Emma believed every loose end was being tied together, Linda was arranging one final invitation that would bring the past crashing into the future with consequences none of them could have imagined. As the wedding drew closer, Emma noticed that Linda had become unusually protective of the guest list. Every time Emma offered to help organize seating assignments or double-check RSVPs, Linda would gently wave her away, insisting there was nothing left to worry about. "You've got enough on your plate," she would say with a reassuring smile. "Let me take care of this one thing." Daniel appreciated Linda's willingness to help, even joking that she deserved an honorary wedding planner certificate by the time everything was over. Emma laughed along, trying to ignore the small feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't one particular incident that bothered her. It was the pattern. Linda suddenly insisted on collecting all last-minute RSVP calls herself. She volunteered to greet vendors without Emma present. She even asked the venue manager to contact her directly if any questions came up during the final week before the ceremony. Everyone interpreted her enthusiasm as the excitement of a mother preparing to watch her daughter get married. No one questioned it because Linda had spent her entire life appearing dependable. She was the woman neighbors trusted with spare house keys, the friend everyone called during emergencies, and the mother who never forgot a birthday or anniversary. People like Linda earned confidence effortlessly, and once that confidence existed, very few people thought to examine what might be happening beneath the surface. A week before the wedding, Emma met her childhood friend Melissa for lunch at a small cafe they had visited countless times over the years. Between conversations about honeymoon plans and wedding decorations, Melissa hesitated before asking a question that immediately changed the mood at the table. She quietly wondered whether Emma had heard from Ryan recently. Emma looked up in surprise and shook her head. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly 3 years, and as far as she knew, he had respected her decision to move on. Melissa seemed relieved by the answer, but admitted she had seen Ryan leaving a restaurant across town with Linda only a few weeks earlier. She almost walked over to say hello before realizing the conversation between them looked unusually serious. Emma laughed nervously, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. Perhaps Melissa had mistaken another man for Ryan, or maybe Linda had simply run into him by chance. After all, they lived in the same city, and unexpected encounters happened all the time. Melissa didn't argue, but before they left the restaurant, she gently reached across the table and said something Emma would replay in her mind again and again. "I've known your mom my whole life," she said quietly. "I've also known you your whole life. If something feels off, don't ignore it just because it's family." Emma smiled politely, thanked her friend for caring, and changed the subject. Deep inside, however, a quiet uneasiness had begun settling into her thoughts. For the first time, she wondered whether Melissa had witnessed something that deserved more attention than either of them realized. That evening, Emma decided to stop by Linda's house without calling first. She wanted to surprise her mother with a framed engagement photo she planned to display at the rehearsal dinner. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed another car parked in front of the house. It was gone by the time she reached the front porch, and Linda answered the door looking slightly startled before quickly composing herself. The living room appeared perfectly ordinary except for one detail Emma couldn't explain. Sitting on the coffee table was a ceramic mug she had seen countless times before because it belonged to Ryan. Years earlier, Emma had bought it for him during a weekend trip to Vermont. The navy blue mug featured the logo of a small mountain cafe they had visited together, and Ryan had joked that he would never drink coffee from anything else. Emma instantly recognized the tiny chip along the handle where it had once fallen from his kitchen counter. Linda noticed Emma staring at it, and casually picked it up before carrying it into the kitchen. She explained that Ryan had donated several household items during a neighborhood charity drive years ago, and that she must have picked it up by coincidence. The explanation sounded possible, yet Emma couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling growing stronger inside her. She left her mother's house trying to convince herself there had to be a reasonable answer. She never considered that the truth was much simpler. Ryan hadn't donated the mug years ago. He had been sitting in that very living room only minutes before Emma arrived, and the conversation he had just finished having with Linda would soon place every person attending the wedding at the center of a moment none of them would ever forget. 3 days before the wedding, the pace of life became so overwhelming that Emma barely had time to think. The florist called twice to confirm delivery times, the bakery requested final approval for the cake design, and relatives from 3 different states began arriving in town. Daniel's parents hosted a casual family barbecue, so both families could spend time together before the rehearsal dinner, and for a few precious hours, everything felt exactly as it should. Laughter filled the backyard, children chased each other across the lawn, and Daniel's father proudly toasted the future, saying he had never seen his son happier. Emma looked around the yard and felt grateful that after years of disappointment and heartache, she had finally found a family that embraced her with genuine warmth. Linda smiled throughout the afternoon, complimenting the decorations and thanking everyone for making the trip. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the proud mother of the bride. Yet every so often, Emma caught her glancing toward her phone before quietly stepping away to answer a message. The conversations were always brief, and when she returned, she acted as though nothing had happened. Daniel noticed it too, but joked that Linda was probably managing 100 wedding details at once. Emma agreed because she wanted to believe that explanation more than anything. She refused to let suspicion steal the joy of the final days before her wedding. Looking back, she would later admit that hope has a way of convincing us to ignore the very things we should pay the closest attention to. The following afternoon, Emma visited the chapel alone to spend a few quiet moments reflecting before the whirlwind of the rehearsal began. The sanctuary was empty except for the wedding coordinator arranging flowers near the altar. Emma slowly walked down the aisle, imagining Daniel waiting for her at the front of the church, and for the first time in weeks, she felt completely at peace. As she turned to leave, she noticed the coordinator reviewing a seating chart with another staff member. One sentence immediately caught her attention. "We'll place the special guest in the reserved family section just like Mrs. Carter requested." Emma paused for only a moment before asking who the special guest was. The coordinator looked confused and quickly apologized, explaining that Linda had personally updated the seating arrangements earlier that morning and had instructed the staff that one additional guest would be arriving separately. Emma assumed it must be an elderly relative whose travel plans had changed at the last minute. Linda had mentioned several family members were still trying to rearrange flights, so the explanation seemed reasonable enough. Still, something about the words reserved family section echoed in her thoughts during the drive home. Emma considered calling her mother for clarification but decided against it. There were already enough emotions surrounding the wedding, and she didn't want to create unnecessary tension over what was probably a simple misunderstanding. Unfortunately, the question she chose not to ask would become the question everyone wished had been answered before the ceremony began. That evening, Daniel received an unexpected phone call from his best man, Ethan, who sounded unusually serious. Ethan explained that while picking up his tuxedo from the tailor, he thought he recognized a familiar face leaving the neighboring coffee shop with Linda. At first, he couldn't remember where he had seen the man before, but then it came to him. It was Ryan, the man Emma had dated years earlier. Ethan hesitated before mentioning it because he didn't want to create drama so close to the wedding, yet the encounter had felt too unusual to ignore. Daniel thanked him for sharing what he had seen, but asked him not to mention it to Emma until they understood what was going on. After ending the call, Daniel sat quietly in his office for several minutes, staring at the engagement photo resting on his desk. He trusted Emma completely, and he believed she had moved on from her past long ago. What troubled him wasn't Emma's behavior. It was Linda's. Why would she meet privately with a man who had been absent from Emma's life for years, especially only days before the wedding? Daniel considered confronting Linda immediately, but another thought stopped him. If there was an innocent explanation, accusing her would only hurt the family days before the ceremony. If there wasn't an innocent explanation, confronting her too early might only give her time to hide whatever she was planning. So Daniel made a quiet decision that would shape everything that followed. He would say nothing, watch carefully, and wait. He had no way of knowing that by choosing patience over confrontation, he was allowing events to unfold exactly as Linda intended, setting the stage for a revelation that would leave an entire chapel sitting in stunned silence. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived with bright skies and the kind of excitement that only comes once in a lifetime. Emma woke before sunrise, unable to sleep because her mind kept racing through the schedule for the next 48 hours. She checked her phone and smiled at the dozens of messages from friends wishing her luck, sending photos from their flights, and reminding her to enjoy every second because the day would pass faster than she expected. Daniel had already texted her a simple message that read, "2 more mornings, and you'll be my wife." Emma laughed softly, reading it 3 times before replying with a heart emoji and a promise that she couldn't wait to see him at the rehearsal. It was the kind of ordinary exchange that made her feel safe. Daniel never needed grand speeches to remind her how much she meant to him. His consistency spoke louder than dramatic declarations ever could. As she drove to the venue later that afternoon, she caught herself imagining the life waiting on the other side of the wedding. Weekend breakfasts together, family vacations, someday raising children, and growing old beside someone who had never given her a reason to question his loyalty. Those dreams felt closer than ever, and for a brief moment, Emma believed the difficult chapters of her life had finally come to an end. She couldn't have known that only a few miles away, another conversation was taking place that threatened to pull those dreams apart before they even had a chance to begin. Linda had arranged to meet Ryan one final time before the ceremony. They chose a quiet cafe on the edge of town where very few people knew either of them. Ryan arrived first, looking noticeably different from the confident young man Emma had dated years earlier. Time had softened some of the sharp edges in his personality, but there was still a restlessness about him that made it clear he hadn't completely made peace with the past. Linda sat across from him and slid a cream-colored envelope across the table. Inside was a formal wedding invitation with Ryan's name printed neatly in elegant lettering. He stared at it for several seconds without saying a word. According to Linda, Emma still cared about him more than she was willing to admit. She insisted that once Emma saw him, old feelings would return, and she would finally realize she was making the wrong decision by marrying Daniel. Ryan listened quietly before asking the one question Linda hadn't expected. "Did Emma tell you she wants me there?" Linda looked away for only a moment before answering that Emma was simply too stubborn to admit what was truly in her heart. Ryan remained silent. Part of him wanted to believe Linda because accepting her version of events was easier than accepting that the woman he had once loved had genuinely moved on. Before they stood to leave, Linda reminded him to arrive early and sit where she instructed. She assured him that everything would work out once Emma had the chance to see him. Neither of them noticed the man sitting several tables away, reading a newspaper while quietly observing every word of their conversation. That man was Daniel's older cousin, Mark, who had stopped at the cafe during a business trip before heading to the rehearsal dinner. At first, he paid little attention to the pair sitting nearby, but the names Emma and wedding immediately caught his ear. He recognized Linda from family gatherings and, after a few more minutes, realized the man across from her matched the photograph Emma had once shown everyone when explaining why an old relationship had ended. Mark didn't hear every detail of their discussion, but he heard enough to understand one thing with complete certainty. Ryan had been invited to the wedding by Linda herself. Unsure how to respond, Mark immediately called Daniel and asked if they could meet before the rehearsal began. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, expecting an ordinary family matter. Instead, Mark repeated everything he had witnessed as accurately as he could remember. Daniel didn't interrupt once. When Mark finished speaking, silence filled the car. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Every uneasy feeling from the past week suddenly connected into one unmistakable picture. The private phone calls, the unexplained meetings, the mysterious addition to the guest list, the reserved seat inside the chapel. None of it had been accidental. Someone was deliberately bringing Emma's past into the most important day of their future together. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment before making a decision that surprised even Mark. "Don't tell Emma," he said quietly. "Not yet." Mark stared at him in disbelief, but Daniel explained that if they confronted Linda immediately, she would deny everything or change her plans before the truth could fully come to light. Daniel wanted answers, and more importantly, he wanted Emma to know exactly who had betrayed her and why. As they drove toward the rehearsal dinner, neither man realized they were only hours away from discovering that Linda's plan reached far beyond simply inviting an unwanted guest. Ryan hadn't been given just a seat at the wedding. He had been given a role, and the moment Linda expected him to play would leave every person inside that chapel struggling to believe what they had just witnessed. The rehearsal dinner began with the kind of warmth every couple hopes to remember for the rest of their lives. Friends reunited after years apart, relatives shared stories from childhood, and laughter echoed across the banquet hall as waiters carried plates from table to table. Emma looked around the room and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Daniel's family welcomed everyone with genuine kindness, making sure no guest felt forgotten. His parents moved from table to table introducing distant cousins, while his younger sister organized a slideshow filled with photographs from their relationship. Every image reminded Emma of how far she and Daniel had come together. There were pictures from hiking trips, birthdays, holiday dinners, and the afternoon they adopted the golden retriever that had quickly become the center of their home. Looking at those memories, Emma couldn't stop smiling. She had spent years believing happiness always came with conditions, only to discover that real peace often arrived quietly. Across the room, Linda watched the slideshow with a polite smile, applauding alongside everyone else. No one noticed that every few minutes she discreetly checked her watch, almost as though she were waiting for something to happen. Daniel noticed. He had been watching Linda carefully ever since speaking with Mark, looking for anything that confirmed his growing suspicions. Instead of confronting her, he simply observed, allowing the evening to unfold naturally. He wanted facts, not assumptions, because once the truth came out, there would be no repairing whatever remained of the relationship between Emma and her mother. Halfway through dinner, Daniel quietly excused himself and stepped outside to answer what appeared to be a phone call. In reality, he had arranged to meet Mark in the parking lot. Mark had spent the afternoon gathering information after leaving the cafe, hoping there was still a reasonable explanation for what he had overheard. Unfortunately, every answer only raised more questions. The wedding coordinator had confirmed that Linda personally requested a last-minute seating change for one unnamed guest and insisted that no one discuss it with Emma because she wanted it to be a surprise. Daniel stood silently as Mark spoke, his jaw tightening with every new detail. "I don't understand why she'd do this," Mark admitted. "Unless she honestly believes she's helping." Daniel nodded slowly because that possibility had crossed his mind more than once. Linda had never openly accepted him. She had always been respectful, but there was a distance in her behavior that now seemed easier to understand. Perhaps she truly believed Ryan belonged with Emma. Perhaps she thought enough time had passed for old feelings to return. Whatever her reason, she had chosen to keep everyone else in the dark, including the one person whose opinion mattered most. Daniel looked toward the banquet hall through the large glass windows. Inside, Emma was laughing with her bridesmaids, completely unaware that people she loved were making decisions about her future without her knowledge. In that moment, Daniel made another promise to himself. No matter what happened tomorrow, Emma would never have to face it alone. As the evening came to an end, guests slowly began leaving the venue, exchanging hugs and promising to arrive early for the ceremony. Emma stayed behind for a few extra minutes to gather gifts and thank the staff. While walking through the nearly empty hall, she noticed Linda standing near the entrance speaking softly with someone whose back was turned toward her. Before Emma could get closer, the man slipped outside through a side door and disappeared into the parking lot. Who was that? Emma asked casually as she approached. Linda barely hesitated before answering that it was the florist confirming tomorrow's delivery schedule. Emma accepted the explanation, although something about it didn't sit right. She had met the florist several times over the past few months, and the man's height, posture, and voice didn't seem familiar. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Tomorrow was her wedding day. She refused to spend the night searching for problems that might not exist. As she and Daniel drove home, separately according to tradition, Emma smiled to herself, believing the next time she saw him would be at the altar. Daniel smiled too, but for an entirely different reason. Earlier that evening, while everyone was focused on speeches and celebrations, he had quietly asked one trusted friend to remain near the chapel entrance throughout the ceremony. If Ryan appeared, Daniel wanted to know the exact moment he arrived. He still hoped none of Mark's suspicions would prove true. Yet, deep inside, he had begun preparing for the possibility that the most important day of his life would also become the day one family's carefully hidden secrets were finally exposed in front of everyone they loved. Wedding morning arrived with the quiet excitement that follows months of planning and years of dreaming. Before the sun had fully risen, the bridal suite at the historic chapel was already alive with movement. Makeup artists arranged brushes across long tables, hairstylists hurried from chair to chair, and bridesmaids laughed as they tried to calm one another's nerves. Emma stood near the large window overlooking the gardens, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold because she had been too excited to drink it. Every few minutes someone reminded her to sit down, relax, and enjoy the morning, but her heart was racing with anticipation. She wasn't anxious about marrying Daniel. If anything, she had never felt more certain about a decision. What overwhelmed her was the realization that after today, life would never be the same again. She thought about the promises they were about to make, the home they had already begun furnishing together, and the future they had planned in countless late-night conversations. Her father, Michael, quietly entered the room carrying a small velvet box containing a bracelet that had belonged to Emma's late grandmother. Without saying much, he fastened it around her wrist and smiled proudly. "Your grandmother would have loved this day," he whispered. Emma hugged him tightly, fighting back tears. It was one of those moments she wished could last forever, untouched by anything capable of changing its meaning. Outside the room, guests continued arriving one family at a time, filling the chapel with cheerful conversations and warm embraces, completely unaware that another guest was driving toward the ceremony with an invitation almost no one knew existed. Across town, Ryan sat alone inside his car in the chapel parking lot nearly an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The cream-colored invitation rested on the passenger seat beside him. He had picked it up several times during the drive, reading his own name over and over as though hoping the words might suddenly reveal a different explanation. The conversation with Linda at the cafe echoed through his mind. She had assured him that Emma still had unresolved feelings, that seeing him would force an honest conversation before it was too late. Yet the closer he came to the chapel, the less convinced he became. He remembered the pain on Emma's face the day they ended their relationship, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder whether he had spent too long believing his own version of the past instead of hers. He considered starting the car and leaving before anyone saw him. That option remained available until his phone vibrated with a new message from Linda. It contained only a few words. "Everything is ready. Come inside through the east entrance." Ryan stared at the screen for several long seconds before locking his phone and stepping out of the car. Every step toward the chapel felt heavier than the one before. He wasn't walking with confidence anymore. He was walking with questions he could no longer ignore. Inside the chapel, Daniel stood with Ethan and the other groomsmen in a private room behind the sanctuary. They adjusted ties, joked about married life, and tried to keep the atmosphere light, but Daniel's attention remained fixed on his phone. A message finally appeared from the friend he had stationed near the entrance. It was short enough to read in a single glance. "He's here." Daniel slowly slipped the phone back into his pocket without saying a word. Ethan immediately noticed the change in his expression and quietly asked if something was wrong. Daniel looked toward the closed doors leading into the sanctuary before answering. "Everything is about to make sense." Moments later, another message arrived. Linda greeted him personally. She walked him to a reserved seat near the front. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. The last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. There was no misunderstanding, no coincidence, no innocent explanation waiting to clear everything up. Linda had deliberately brought Ryan into the chapel and placed him where Emma could not possibly miss him. Daniel had one final opportunity to stop the ceremony before Emma entered the sanctuary, to spare her the shock he knew was waiting beyond those doors. He took one step toward the hallway, then stopped. If he interrupted everything now, Linda could still claim it had all been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Emma deserved more than assumptions. She deserved the truth revealed in full view of everyone involved. Daniel straightened his jacket, took a slow breath, and returned to his place beside the altar. Beyond the closed sanctuary doors, the music began to play, signaling that the bride was only moments away from walking down the aisle toward a future she believed she understood. Within minutes, one glance across a crowded chapel would change that future forever. As the first notes of the processional echoed through the chapel, every guest rose to their feet. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation, cameras lifted into the air, and quiet smiles spread across familiar faces. Daniel stood at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him, trying to appear calm even though his heart was beating harder than it ever had before. His eyes never left the entrance at the back of the sanctuary. He wasn't searching for Ryan. He already knew exactly where Ryan was sitting. Instead, he was waiting for Emma, praying that no matter what happened over the next few minutes, she would know without question that he was standing beside her. At the rear of the chapel, Emma took a deep breath as her father offered his arm. The wedding coordinator smiled warmly and whispered that everything was ready. Emma nodded, completely unaware that only a few rows ahead, Ryan sat quietly in a reserved seat near the front of the chapel, exactly where Linda had arranged for him to be. Linda herself sat only a few feet away, occasionally glancing toward Ryan before turning her attention back toward the entrance. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary wedding. Only 3 people inside the building knew that something extraordinary was about to happen, and each of them believed the next few moments would end very differently. The chapel doors slowly opened, and every head turned toward the bride. Emma stepped forward, holding her father's arm with a smile that reflected months of hope, healing, and anticipation. She looked first toward Daniel, whose expression immediately reassured her. Then, almost without thinking, her eyes drifted across the first few rows of guests. Everything inside her seemed to stop. Sitting less than 20 feet away was Ryan. Their eyes met for the first time in more than 3 years. Emma froze so suddenly that her father instinctively tightened his grip on her arm to steady her. A wave of whispers moved through the chapel as guests noticed the hesitation. Some assumed the bride had become overwhelmed with emotion. Others followed her line of sight until they recognized the unfamiliar man seated among close family members. Emma looked toward her mother, searching desperately for some explanation that made sense. Linda didn't appear surprised. Instead, she offered a small, encouraging smile and gave the slightest nod of her head, almost as though she were reassuring Emma that everything was unfolding exactly as planned. That single gesture answered the question Emma hadn't even found the words to ask. Ryan hadn't come by accident. Someone had wanted him there. Someone she loved had made sure he would witness the most important moment of her life. Emma felt tears gathering in her eyes, not because Ryan had returned, but because she suddenly understood who had opened the door for him. For several long seconds, no one moved. The musicians quietly continued playing, uncertain whether to stop. Daniel watched Emma carefully, refusing to rush her or call out her name. He wanted her to make the next decision herself. Emma slowly turned back toward him. Instead of seeing fear or anger, she saw quiet reassurance. Daniel gave her the smallest nod, silently telling her that she wasn't facing this alone. That simple gesture gave her the strength to take another step, then another, until she was once again walking down the aisle. Guests released the breath they hadn't realized they were holding, believing the interruption had passed. Linda smiled with relief, convinced Emma's decision to continue walking meant her plan had worked exactly as she intended. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the floor, unable to meet Emma's gaze again. Yet beneath the surface, everything had already changed. Emma no longer walked toward the altar with only excitement in her heart. She walked carrying a painful question that demanded an answer. Why would her own mother choose this day, of all days, to bring back the man who had caused her so much pain? Daniel already knew the answer was waiting. He had decided before the ceremony began that once the vows were complete, there would be no more whispered conversations, hidden meetings, or carefully guarded secrets. Before the sun set on their wedding day, the truth would be spoken aloud for everyone in that chapel to hear, including the one person who believed she had controlled every detail from the very beginning. Against every expectation, the ceremony continued. The minister welcomed everyone, spoke about love, commitment, and the importance of building a marriage on honesty and trust, words that carried a meaning only a handful of people inside the chapel fully understood. Emma stood across from Daniel, trying to focus on the promises they were making to one another, yet every so often her eyes drifted toward the front row where Linda sat with an expression that was impossible to read. Ryan remained unusually quiet, never once attempting to interrupt or draw attention to himself. In fact, he looked increasingly uncomfortable as the ceremony progressed. as though he were beginning to realize he had stepped into a situation far different from the one he had been led to believe. When Emma and Daniel exchanged vows, there wasn't a single trace of hesitation in either of their voices. They spoke with sincerity, promising to stand beside each other through every challenge life might bring. Daniel looked directly into Emma's eyes as he repeated each word, making sure she understood one simple truth without having to say it aloud. Whatever happened after the ceremony, they would face it together. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause. Friends cheered. Family members wiped tears from their eyes. And for a brief moment it appeared as though the day had survived the unexpected shock waiting inside those chapel doors. Emma kissed Daniel, and together they walked back down the aisle while guests celebrated around them. Yet beneath the smiles and applause, several people knew the real confrontation had only been delayed. The reception was held at a restored country estate only a short drive from the chapel. By the time the newlyweds arrived, the ballroom was glowing beneath crystal chandeliers, and guests had already begun enjoying cocktails on the outdoor terrace. Emma greeted relatives with genuine warmth, determined not to allow the events at the chapel to overshadow the beginning of her marriage. She thanked friends for traveling long distances, posed for photographs, and laughed whenever someone shared an embarrassing childhood story. To everyone watching from a distance, she looked like any joyful bride enjoying the happiest day of her life. Only Daniel noticed the way her smile occasionally faded whenever her eyes searched the room for Linda. Ryan remained near the edge of the reception hall, speaking to almost no one. Several guests assumed he was an old family friend they had simply never met before. Others quietly wondered why he seemed so uncomfortable. Linda moved confidently from table to table, greeting everyone with the ease of someone convinced she had done nothing wrong. Every now and then she glanced toward Emma and Ryan, almost as though she were waiting for an interaction that never came. Daniel watched all of it in silence. He wasn't angry anymore. He was patient. He believed people eventually revealed themselves if given enough time, and he sensed that Linda was becoming increasingly frustrated because the reunion she had imagined wasn't unfolding the way she expected. About an hour into the reception, as dinner plates were being cleared and preparations for the speeches began, Emma finally reached her limit. She quietly asked Linda if they could speak privately for a few minutes. Linda smiled, apparently believing her daughter wanted to thank her for the wedding or discuss something unrelated. Together, they stepped into a small garden behind the reception hall, where the sounds of music and conversation became little more than a distant echo. Emma stood silently for several moments before asking the question she had carried with her ever since entering the chapel. Why was Ryan at my wedding? Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands together and looked toward the gardens, choosing her words carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost reassuring. Because someone had to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Emma stared at her mother, unable to believe what she had just heard. Linda continued before Emma could respond. She insisted Daniel was a good man, but claimed Ryan was the only person who had ever truly belonged with her daughter. She admitted she had stayed in contact with him after the breakup because she believed Emma had acted out of temporary anger rather than genuine conviction. She confessed that she had invited him herself, arranged his seat inside the chapel, and hoped that seeing him one last time before exchanging vows would awaken feelings Emma had supposedly buried instead of resolved. Emma felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate decision made by the one person she believed would always protect her. Before Emma could gather the words to answer, another voice quietly broke the silence from behind them. Linda, that's not the story you told me. Emma and Linda turned at the same moment. Standing only a few steps away was Ryan, and from the look on his face, it was clear he had heard every single word. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The soft music drifting from the reception hall suddenly felt a million miles away as Emma, Linda, and Ryan stood frozen in the garden. Ryan looked from Emma to Linda and back again, struggling to understand how two completely different versions of the same story could exist. Finally, he broke the silence. You told me Emma wanted to see me one last time before the wedding, he said, his voice steady but filled with disbelief. You said she still had questions she never answered. You told me she was marrying Daniel because she was afraid of taking another chance with me. Linda's expression changed instantly. For the first time all day, the confidence she had carried so carefully began to disappear. Emma slowly turned toward her mother, searching for any sign that Ryan had misunderstood, but none came. Instead, Linda quietly admitted that she had believed a surprise reunion would force both of them to confront feelings they had been avoiding for years. She insisted she never intended to embarrass anyone. In her mind, she had been trying to save Emma from what she considered a lifetime of regret. Emma felt tears gathering again, not because of Ryan's presence, but because she realized her mother had never truly listened to her after the breakup. Every conversation, every explanation, every painful memory Emma had shared had been quietly dismissed because Linda believed she understood her daughter's heart better than Emma understood it herself. Ryan lowered his head and let out a slow breath. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "The closer I got to the chapel, the more this felt wrong." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the cream-colored invitation Linda had given him only days earlier. Holding it between his fingers, he continued, "You convinced me Emma still loved me. You said she was only marrying Daniel because everyone expected her to move on. I believed you because, honestly, it was easier than accepting that she had already built a happy life without me." His voice carried genuine regret rather than bitterness. Then he looked directly at Emma for the first time since the ceremony. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not just for today, for everything. I spent years telling myself our relationship ended because of bad timing or misunderstandings. Hearing you today, hearing your mother, I finally understand that I was holding on to a version of our past that only existed in my own mind." Emma listened without interrupting. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time she sensed he wasn't trying to reclaim a place in her life. He was acknowledging the damage that had already been done. Before anyone could speak again, footsteps approached from the reception hall. Daniel had noticed Emma had been gone longer than expected and had quietly followed her outside. Daniel stepped into the garden and immediately understood from the expressions around him that the truth had finally surfaced. Without raising his voice, he walked beside Emma and gently took her hand. Linda looked at him, hoping he might somehow understand her intentions, but Daniel spoke before she had the chance. "I knew Ryan was coming before the ceremony," he said calmly. Emma looked at him in surprise. Daniel explained everything. Ethan's phone call after the tailor shop. Mark overhearing the conversation at the cafe. The messages confirming Ryan's arrival at the chapel. Every piece of the puzzle had pointed to Linda, but Daniel had deliberately stayed silent because he wanted facts instead of accusations. He wanted Emma to hear the truth from the people involved rather than from rumors or assumptions. Linda stared at him in disbelief. "You knew?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "I hoped I was wrong," he replied. "I hoped there was an explanation that would protect this family. Instead, you confirmed exactly what I was afraid of." At that moment, the reception hall doors opened again as several family members stepped outside, wondering why the bride, groom, mother of the bride, and an unfamiliar guest had all disappeared at the same time. Within moments, nearly everyone closest to them stood in the garden. No one spoke. They simply looked from one face to another, sensing they had arrived in the middle of a conversation that was about to change this family forever. The silence that settled over the garden was heavier than any argument could have been. Family members exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for someone else to explain why the bride was standing in tears, why the groom looked unusually composed, and why Linda seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes. Emma's father, Michael, stepped forward first. "What's going on?" he asked quietly, looking from his daughter to his wife. Linda opened her mouth as though searching for the right words, but none came. Instead, Ryan spoke before anyone else could. He held up the cream-colored invitation and said, "I wasn't here because Emma invited me. Mrs. Carter invited me herself." The words landed like a shockwave. Conversations around the garden stopped immediately. Emma's bridesmaids looked at one another in disbelief, while Daniel's parents stood silently, trying to process what they had just heard. Michael slowly turned toward Linda, his face filled with confusion rather than anger. "Please tell me that's not true," he said softly. Linda remained silent for several seconds before quietly answering, "It is." A collective gasp spread through the group. Emma closed her eyes as fresh tears rolled down her face. Hearing the truth from Linda herself somehow hurt even more than discovering Ryan inside the chapel. It wasn't simply that her mother had invited her former boyfriend. It was the realization that every decision had been carefully planned without a single thought for how it would affect the daughter she claimed to love. Linda finally lifted her head and looked around at the people gathered before her. "I know all of you think I've done something unforgivable," she began, her voice trembling for the first time all day. "But I did what I believed was right." She explained that she had watched Emma and Ryan together for years and genuinely believed they belonged with one another despite the breakup. She admitted she never fully trusted Daniel, not because he had treated Emma badly, but because she feared her daughter was moving on too quickly from someone she once intended to marry. Linda confessed that after the breakup, Ryan continued reaching out to her occasionally, asking how Emma was doing. Those conversations eventually became regular phone calls, then lunches, and finally private meetings. Over time, Linda convinced herself she could repair what she believed had been a broken relationship rather than a necessary ending. She insisted she never intended to destroy the wedding. In her mind, Ryan's presence would simply give Emma one final opportunity to reconsider before making what Linda feared would become a lifelong mistake. As she finished speaking, even those trying to understand her reasoning struggled to reconcile her intentions with the consequences. Daniel's mother quietly wiped away tears, while Michael stood motionless, realizing that the woman he had shared his life with for more than 30 years had kept an enormous secret from everyone, including him. Emma listened without interrupting until her mother finally fell silent. Then, with remarkable composure, she took one slow step forward. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked. "It isn't that Ryan was sitting in that chapel." Linda looked at her hopefully, as though expecting there might still be a path toward forgiveness. Emma continued, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "It isn't even that you spoke to him behind my back for years. It's that you never believed me." Tears filled Linda's eyes as Emma went on. "When I told you I wasn't happy, you thought I was confused. When I told you why I ended the relationship, you decided I would eventually change my mind. When I chose Daniel, you couldn't accept that I knew what was best for my own life. Every important decision I've made, you've treated like it needed your approval before it could become real." No one moved as Emma spoke. Every sentence revealed years of quiet disappointment that had never been fully expressed. Finally, she looked directly into her mother's eyes and said the words that seemed to stop time itself. "Today wasn't the day you lost Ryan. Today was the day you lost my trust." Linda covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Michael closed his eyes, understanding immediately that some wounds could not be healed with apologies alone. Around them, the reception continued inside the ballroom, completely unaware that outside, a family was being changed forever. Emma reached for Daniel's hand once more, and together they turned toward the reception hall. Before taking another step, Daniel looked back at Ryan. Ryan understood without a word. He quietly folded the invitation, placed it in his pocket, and walked away from the estate alone, leaving behind the past he had finally accepted was never coming back. Emma and Daniel returned to the reception hand in hand, but the atmosphere had changed in a way only they fully understood. Most of the guests had no idea what had taken place in the garden. They simply assumed the bride and groom had stepped outside for a quiet moment together before the evening speeches. The band continued playing softly, waiters refilled glasses, and children danced near the edge of the ballroom as though nothing unusual had happened. Emma paused just inside the entrance and looked around the room. Only minutes earlier, she had wondered whether the reception would become remembered as the day her mother nearly ruined her wedding. Now she realized something very different. This day would be remembered as the day the truth finally stopped hiding. Daniel gently squeezed her hand and whispered, "This day still belongs to us." Those 5 words settled something inside Emma that had been shaking since she first saw Ryan inside the chapel. She smiled through her tears, took a slow breath, and walked with Daniel toward the center of the ballroom. Family members and friends began applauding once again, unaware that the strongest promise of the day had not been spoken at the altar, but in the quiet understanding that neither of them would allow someone else's choices to define the beginning of their marriage. A few minutes later, it was time for the traditional speeches. Daniel's best man spoke first, sharing light-hearted stories that filled the room with laughter. Emma's maid of honor followed, recalling childhood memories that left many guests wiping away tears of happiness. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel stood and politely asked if he could say a few words before dinner continued. The room immediately fell silent. Emma looked at him with curiosity because they had never planned for him to give an additional speech. Daniel picked up the microphone, smiled warmly at everyone in attendance, and began by thanking every guest for celebrating such an important day with them. He spoke about the meaning of marriage, explaining that love was never built on perfection but on honesty, respect, and the courage to remain united when life became difficult. He never mentioned Linda or Ryan by name. He never embarrassed anyone or revealed what had happened outside. Instead, he looked toward Emma and said, "Every marriage will eventually face moments that test its foundation. Some of those moments arrive years later. Ours happened before our first dance. What gives me peace tonight is knowing that the woman standing beside me faced that moment with strength, grace, and a heart that never lost sight of what truly mattered." Guests applauded warmly, believing Daniel was simply speaking about ordinary wedding stress. Only a handful of people understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Emma felt another wave of emotion as she realized Daniel had deliberately chosen compassion over public humiliation. He had every opportunity to expose Linda before the entire reception, yet he protected Emma from reliving the pain in front of hundreds of people who didn't need to become part of their family's private heartbreak. As the applause faded, Emma quietly stood beside Daniel and asked for the microphone. She hadn't planned a speech either, But after everything that had happened, she felt there was one message worth sharing. Looking around the room, she thanked every friend and relative who had supported her throughout her life. She spoke about how easy it is to mistake love for control, and how sometimes people can genuinely believe they are helping while causing unimaginable pain. Then she smiled at Daniel before saying, "Today reminded me that trust is the greatest gift anyone can give another person. It's something that can't be demanded, borrowed, or forced. It has to be protected every single day." She didn't mention her mother directly, yet Linda, who remained quietly seated near the back of the ballroom after returning from the garden, lowered her head because she understood every word. Emma continued, "I hope everyone here leaves tonight remembering one thing. The people we love deserve to make their own choices, even when we disagree with them. Real love doesn't control someone else's future. It stands beside them while they build it." When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause that lasted longer than any speech earlier that evening. Guests believed they had just heard a beautiful reflection on marriage. Linda heard something else entirely. For the first time, she fully understood that her daughter had stopped asking for permission to live her own life years ago. The only person who had never accepted that truth was the woman who had raised her. As Emma and Daniel walked onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife, Linda remained seated, quietly realizing that repairing the relationship she had broken would require far more than saying she was sorry. As the first dance came to an end, the applause echoed through the ballroom once again. Guests smiled, couples joined the dance floor, and the celebration slowly found its rhythm. From a distance, it looked like every other beautiful wedding reception. Yet for the small group of people who knew what had happened outside in the garden, every smile carried a deeper meaning. Daniel's parents quietly embraced Emma after the dance, assuring her that she was now part of their family no matter what challenges lay ahead. His mother gently held Emma's hands and said, "Families aren't defined by the mistakes they make. They're defined by the people who choose to love each other through them." Those words stayed with Emma for the rest of the evening. Across the room, Michael sat alone for several minutes, staring silently at the untouched glass of champagne in front of him. He had spent decades believing he understood every part of his marriage to Linda, only to discover that she had been living with a secret he never suspected. More painful than the deception itself was realizing that while Emma had struggled after ending her relationship with Ryan, he had unknowingly left her to face much of that emotional burden alone. He remembered the evenings when Emma came home unusually quiet after visiting Linda, the time she insisted everything was fine even though her eyes suggested otherwise. Looking back, he finally understood those weren't ordinary disagreements between mother and daughter. They were the result of a wound that had never been allowed to heal because someone kept reopening it. Later that evening, Michael quietly asked Linda if they could speak privately. They stepped onto a small balcony overlooking the estate gardens, where the distant sound of music drifted through the warm evening air. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. Linda's shoulders sank as she admitted she had convinced herself he would never understand. She explained that after Emma ended her relationship with Ryan, she couldn't accept the idea that years of love could simply disappear. She believed Emma had made an emotional decision she would eventually regret, and when Ryan continued reaching out, asking how Emma was doing, Linda saw an opportunity to repair what she believed had been broken. Michael listened carefully before quietly shaking his head. "You weren't repairing anything," he replied. "You were trying to rewrite someone else's life because you couldn't accept that it had changed." Tears rolled down Linda's face as she realized how true those words were. For years, she had confused being protective with being controlling. She believed she was fighting for her daughter's happiness while ignoring the fact that Emma had already found it. Michael gently removed his wedding ring, turning it slowly between his fingers before slipping it back on. "Today wasn't just hard on Emma," he said. "You asked me to build a marriage with you on trust. Today I found out you've been hiding something from me for years." Linda covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the realization that her decisions had damaged far more than one relationship. They had shaken the foundation of her own marriage as well. As the evening drew to a close, guests gathered outside the estate to prepare for the newlyweds' farewell. Sparklers lit the night sky as friends and family formed two long lines leading toward the waiting car. Emma hugged relatives one by one, thanking them for celebrating such an unforgettable day. When she finally reached Linda, both women stood silently for several moments. The excitement surrounding them faded into the background as mother and daughter looked at each other with tears in their eyes. Linda quietly whispered, "I'm sorry." It was the first apology she had offered since everything came to light. Emma listened without interrupting. She believed her mother meant every word, but she also understood that sincere apologies and restored trust were two very different things. She gently hugged Linda before stepping back. "I forgive you," she said softly. Linda's face brightened with hope until Emma continued. "But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It simply means I won't let it define the rest of my life." Linda nodded through tears because she finally understood the difference. Some relationships can survive betrayal, but only after truth, accountability, and time have done the difficult work that apologies alone never could. Emma took Daniel's hand, and together they walked through the line of cheering guests toward the waiting car. As they drove away beneath a sky filled with sparks and celebration, Emma looked back only once. She saw her mother standing beside her father, watching quietly as the car disappeared into the distance. For the first time in years, Emma wasn't looking back because she wished she could return to the past. She was looking back because she had finally left it there, exactly where it belonged. The weeks following the wedding were unlike anything Emma and Daniel had expected. Friends who had attended the ceremony continued talking about how beautiful the day had been, sharing photographs online and reminiscing about the laughter, the vows, and the celebration that carried on well into the night. Very few people knew how close the day had come to ending differently. Emma and Daniel made a quiet decision together that they would not spend the first weeks of their marriage explaining family conflicts to everyone who asked questions. Instead, they focused on building the life they had promised each other. They left for the honeymoon they had planned months earlier, spending 10 peaceful days along the coast of Maine, where early morning walks, long conversations by the ocean, and evenings watching the sunset reminded them why they had chosen one another in the first place. For the first time since the wedding, Emma slept peacefully. She no longer replayed the moment she saw Ryan sitting inside the chapel because another memory had become stronger. Whenever she closed her eyes, she remembered Daniel's reassuring nod from the altar. That silent gesture had become the moment she realized what unconditional support truly looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply someone choosing to stand beside you when life suddenly became uncertain. Emma often told Daniel that the greatest wedding gift he had given her wasn't the honeymoon or the beautiful ceremony. It was the confidence that no matter what happened in the future, they would always face it together instead of allowing fear or misunderstanding to drive them apart. Back home, life was far less peaceful for Linda. The quiet that settled over the family house felt unfamiliar. Emma no longer called every evening as she once had, and although their conversations remained polite whenever they did speak, there was an unmistakable distance that hadn't existed before the wedding. Linda found herself replaying the events of that day over and over, searching for the exact moment everything had fallen apart. At first, she blamed Ryan for accepting the invitation. Then she blamed Daniel for allowing the truth to unfold instead of confronting her privately. Eventually, after weeks of honest reflection, she reached a far more painful conclusion. The person responsible had been staring back at her in the mirror all along. She realized she had spent years loving an idea instead of listening to the reality her daughter had tried to explain. She had convinced herself that experience gave her the right to decide which relationships deserved another chance, forgetting that the only person qualified to make that decision was Emma herself. Michael noticed the change in his wife. She attended counseling through their church, began writing long letters she never mailed, and spent hours reading through old family photo albums, stopping whenever she reached pictures from Emma's childhood. Those photographs reminded her of a little girl who had once trusted her with every secret, every fear, and every dream. Linda finally understood that trust had never disappeared all at once. It had slowly faded every time she chose her own judgment over her daughter's voice. Several months later, Emma received a handwritten letter in the mail. The return address belonged to Ryan. She hesitated before opening it, unsure whether she even wanted to know what it contained. Inside was a simple note spanning only a few pages. Ryan apologized again for attending the wedding and admitted that he had allowed himself to believe a version of the past that no longer existed. He explained that after leaving the reception, he began seeing a therapist to better understand the patterns that had damaged his relationships over the years. He wasn't asking for another chance or even expecting a reply. He simply wanted Emma to know that accepting responsibility had become the first step toward becoming a better person. Emma quietly folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer without responding. She didn't feel anger anymore, but she also didn't feel the need to reopen a chapter that had already reached its conclusion. Later that evening, she showed the letter to Daniel, who read it carefully before handing it back with a gentle smile. "Some people spend their whole lives refusing to grow," he said. "If he's truly changing, I hope he keeps going." Emma nodded in agreement. She wished Ryan well, but from a distance. Some stories deserve a second chance. Others deserve a peaceful ending. As she looked around the home she and Daniel were building together, she realized something that had taken years to understand. Healing isn't measured by forgetting what happened. It's measured by reaching a point where the past no longer has the power to decide your future. And before this story comes to an end, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found yourself in Emma's position, would you have forgiven your mother, or would you have walked away completely? Share your answer in the comments because every perspective tells a different story. If this emotional journey touched you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable true-style storytelling experience. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.